the blood-stained wedding. Rain poured relentlessly over the Gothic gates of the Thorne estate on the quiet outskirts of London, turning the winding stone driveway into a sea of murky reflections. Inside the dimly lit conservatory, Zoya stood before a full-length gilded mirror in her delicate white lace bridal gown. At 24, she was the sole heiress to the vast Thorne logistics empire, inheriting everything after her father's sudden passing the year before. Tonight was supposed to be the happiest night of her life. Her marriage to Julian, the dashing, smooth-talking CFO who had swept her off her feet during her grief. As the wedding bells echoed softly from the main hall, Julian walked into the room, impeccably dressed in a custom black tuxedo. He stepped silently behind Zoya, placing his warm hands gently on her exposed shoulders. But his eyes in the mirror were completely cold, devoid of the affection he had faked for months. Before Zoya could speak, Julian whipped a heavy silk cord from his jacket pocket, looped it around her neck, and pulled tight. Zoya gasped, her fingers clawing frantically at her throat as her vision blurred and tears streamed down her face. Julian leaned close to her ear, whispering with a chilling smile that her father's fortune was finally his, and that her tragedy was his ultimate triumph. As Zoya's strength faded, he dragged her limp body out to the cliffside balcony overlooking the roaring sea. With a final, brutal shove, Julian launched her over the stone railing. Zoya fell into the dark, raging ocean waves below, her white gown swirling in the icy foam as her breath faded into absolute darkness. Miles away along the rocky coastline, in the cramped, flickering emergency ward of a public hospital, 21-year-old Maya lay on a cold gurney. She was a broke, quiet orphan who had just succumbed to a severe, long-standing heart condition. As the heart monitor flatlined with a steady, haunting beep and the doctors called her official time of death, a sudden surge of kinetic energy rippled through the room. In a blinding flash of cosmic collision, Zoya's dying fury fused violently with Maya's lifeless body. Maya suddenly bolted upright, gasping heavily for air as her heart restarted with a violent thump against her ribs. The shocked medical staff backed away in disbelief. Maya looked around the sterile room, staring at her pale, calloused hands in utter horror. Touching her face, she realized the reflection in the dark glass window was not Zoya Thorne, but a completely different girl. Her mind surged with Zoya's memories, Julian's cold eyes, the tightening silk cord, and his sickening whisper. Just then, a nurse turned on the wall-mounted television, where an urgent breaking news banner flashed. Tragic loss. Heiress Zoya Thorne drowns in wedding night accident. On screen, Julian was seen weeping in front of reporters, declaring his undying love for his late wife. Maya's hands clenched into tight, trembling fists. The fear in her new eyes slowly hardened into a cold, lethal gaze. Julian thought he had buried her, but Zoya was back, trapped inside Maya's body with an unquenchable thirst for vengeance. A second heartbeat. The morning light streamed through the dusty blinds of the public hospital ward, casting harsh, linear shadows across Maya's narrow bed. Discharge papers sat on the bedside table. To the nurses and resident doctors, her sudden recovery was a medical anomaly, a miracle to be documented and filed away. But to the soul residing inside her, it was a terrifying resurrection. Maya discharged herself without saying a word. She walked out into the chilly London rain, her thin canvas shoes soaking through within minutes. As she navigated the crowded city sidewalks, two distinct sets of memories fought for dominance inside her brain. One belonged to Maya, a timid, orphan shop assistant who had lived in quiet poverty, struggling to pay rent for a damp basement apartment. The other belonged to Zoya, the highly educated, fiercely sharp heiress who had grown up in luxury, fluent in international corporate finance and legal loopholes. She made her way to a public library, pulling up news articles on a flickering computer monitor. The media circus was in full swing. Julian was playing the grieving widower to perfection, staging public memorial services while secretly filing emergency petitions to assume full control of Thorne logistics. Every headline, every photograph of Julian dabbing fake tears with a silk handkerchief made Maya's jaw clench until her teeth burned. She knew she couldn't strike back as a penniless orphan. Revenge required leverage, authority, and above all, capital. Maya left the library and traveled straight to the financial district of Mayfair. She stopped outside a discreet, century-old private wealth institution. Taking a deep, steadying breath, She stepped inside, her posture instantly shifting. The slump in her shoulders vanished, her chin tilted upward with the effortless, regal composure that Zoya had possessed since childhood. She sat down across from a senior private banker, requested a secure terminal, and entered a 24-digit master key for a blind offshore account, a contingency vault her late father had created for emergency liquidity, known only to him and Zoya. When the green light flashed on the banker's screen, confirming a multi-million-pound balance under an anonymous bearer trust, the banker's patronizing tone vanished instantly. He bowed his head, asking how Ms. Lin would like her accounts restructured. Maya leaned back in the plush leather chair, a cold, unyielding smile touching her lips. With millions at her disposal, she didn't just have money, she had a second chance. The weak, frightened girl who was thrown off a cliff was dead. In her place stood a ghost with deep pockets, an untouchable identity, and a meticulous plan to dismantle Julian's life piece by piece. The ghost of Mayfair. 6 months passed in a blur of intense, calculated preparation. Maya transformed herself entirely. She used her vast, secret fortune to hire elite private instructors, posture coaches, and tactical trainers. Under their guidance, she honed Maya's frail body into a posture of flawless grace and unyielding steel. She shed the timid, hesitant demeanor of the poor shop assistant, stepping into the skin of a formidable corporate predator. She secured an immaculate, multi-million-pound townhouse in London's prestigious Mayfair district, establishing herself in the upper echelons of European finance under her new identity, Maya Lin, the elusive managing director of Lin Capital. Meanwhile, Julian had officially taken the reins of Thorne Enterprises. But behind the polished press releases, he was drowning. His arrogant, high-risk financial gambles and lavish spending had left the logistics giant teetering on the edge of insolvency. He desperately needed a major cash infusion to keep his empire from crumbling under federal scrutiny. The opportunity came on a rainy Thursday night at a high-profile contemporary art gala in central London. The grand hall was filled with billionaires, politicians, and media moguls. Julian stood near the center of the room, sipping champagne, laughing loudly with potential investors who remained skeptical of his numbers. Then, the heavy oak doors opened. Maya walked into the ballroom, and a subtle hush rippled through the surrounding crowd. She wore a dramatic, floor-length emerald green silk gown, the exact color Zoya had favored for every major corporate event. Diamond drops hung from her ears, catching the soft glow of the chandeliers. Her posture was razor-sharp, her dark eyes glittering with total composure. Julian glanced toward the entrance, and his glass paused halfway to his lips. Color drained from his face. He stared at her, an eerie, sickening chill running down his spine. She didn't look like Zoya. Her face, her dark hair, and her features belonged to a completely different woman. Yet, the way she glided across the polished marble, the slight, aristocratic tilt of her chin, and the precise, cold rhythm of her stride were unnervingly familiar. It was like looking at a phantom draped in a stranger's skin. Maya glided straight toward Julian, her gaze locked onto his frantic eyes. She stopped a step away, extending a gloved hand with a smooth, hypnotic smile. Maya, Mr. Rothschild, or should I say Mr. Thorne? I've heard so much about your ambition. I am Maya Lin. Julian swallowed hard, taking her hand in a grip that trembled ever so slightly. Up close, her dark eyes pierced through him, carrying a weight of quiet malice that made his pulse race. Julian, voice tight, forcing a polite smile. Ms. Lin, an absolute pleasure. I must admit, you carry yourself like someone I used to know very well. Maya, leaning in slightly, voice dropping to a velvet whisper. Do I? Perhaps we've met in another life, Julian. Or perhaps I'm just the answer to all your financial problems. Julian stared at her, completely captivated, yet deeply unnerved. The trap had been set. The ghost was no longer hiding in the shadows of Brooklyn or the alleys of London. She was standing right in front of her killer, offering him the very rope he would hang himself with. Dance with the devil. Over the weeks that followed, Maya systematically drew Julian deeper into her web. She knew his psychological flaws better than anyone alive, his insatiable greed, his towering ego, and his desperate need for validation from London's old money elite. Playing the role of a fascinated, ultra-wealthy venture capitalist, she began funneling strategic capital into his struggling shipping lines through Lynn Capital, making herself indispensable to his corporate survival. Julian was utterly mesmerized by her. He mistook her intense, penetrating focus for romantic attraction, constantly inviting her to private roof garden dinners, private opera boxes, and exclusive country club galas. Maya accepted every invitation. She played the part of a charmed, sophisticated heiress with terrifying perfection. But every single time Julian touched her arm, guided her across a room, or leaned in to brush his lips against her cheek, Maya's stomach turned to ice. Beneath her serene smile, every nerve in her body screamed, remembering the rough texture of the silk cord cutting into her neck and the cold air as he pushed her off the cliff. One stormy evening, Julian hosted a private dinner for two at his penthouse overlooking the Thames. Soft candlelight flickered against the floor-to-ceiling glass as rain lashed against the windows. Julian poured a glass of vintage red wine, his eyes fixed on Maya with an unsettling intensity. Julian, setting down his glass, voice low. It's strange, Maya. I've built a billion-dollar empire, yet whenever I'm near you, I feel like I'm the one being judged. There's something in the way you look at me, as if you know every dark secret I've ever buried. Maya, swirling her wine calmly, a slow, mesmerizing smile on her lips. Every man in your position has buried something, Julian. A true partner doesn't judge the dirt on your hands, she just makes sure the body stays buried. Julian let out a breathless laugh, captivated by her cold charisma. He reached across the table, taking her hand in a tight grip. Julian, you're different from any woman I've ever met. My late wife, Zoya, she was soft, naive. She thought the world was built on trust. But you understand power. Maya, eyes narrowing slightly, voice smooth as velvet. Trust is a luxury for the weak, Julian. But remember, the people who build empires on blood always have to pay the toll eventually. Some debts are written in stone. Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, an inexplicable shiver running down his spine at her choice of words. But as he raised his glass to toast their new partnership, he had no idea that Maya's team of private forensic accountants was already quietly rerouting his assets into dummy accounts, preparing the financial execution that would ruin him forever. Shadows at the estate. The rain over the English countryside had turned violent by late Friday evening, beating down on the slate roof of the Thorne estate like a rhythmic drumbeat. Inside the mansion, the air felt suffocatingly heavy. After the disastrous fallout at the docks and the sudden freezing of his primary offshore merger, Julian was unraveling fast. He had called an emergency meeting with Maya at the estate, desperate to secure her personal backing to save Thorne Enterprises from complete financial collapse. Returning to the very ground where she had been murdered 6 months ago sent a surge of cold adrenaline through Maya's veins, but she maintained an unyielding, pristine calm. She walked into the dimly lit conservatory, the room where her white gown had once been stained with tears, and where her breath had been stolen by the silk cord. Julian stood near the wide glass balcony doors, holding a crystal tumbler of scotch. Dark circles shadowed his hollow eyes, his hair unkempt, and his tailored suit rumpled. His fingers twitched uncontrollably around the glass. Paranoia had stripped away every trace of his smooth, aristocratic charm. Julian, without turning around, voice rasping. The board called an emergency vote this afternoon, Maya. They've locked my executive credentials. Someone leaked the dockyard wire transfers to the press, and Ethan has disappeared. Maya, stepping smoothly onto the polished marble. Ethan didn't disappear, Julian. He panicked. Traders rarely stay silent when the ship starts sinking. Julian turned around slowly, his gaze locking onto her. He took a heavy gulp of scotch, studying the cool, unbothered way she walked toward the balcony edge, the exact spot where Zoya had spent her final moments. Julian, you don't seem worried. Millions of her capital are tied up in those frozen accounts. Maya, stopping inches from the balcony glass, looking out into the stormy night. Money is easily replaced, Julian. Truth, however, is far more expensive. Julian set his glass down on the mahogany side table with a hard clatter. He took 3 slow, heavy steps toward her, his pulse visible in his neck. Julian, voice dropping into an unsettled whisper. Why did you insist on meeting here? Of all the properties in London, why this room? Maya, turning to face him, a faint, razor-sharp smile on her lips. Because some rooms remember what happened in them. Some balconies still hold the scream of an innocent girl and the breath of the coward who pushed her. Julian froze in his tracks. The color drained completely from his face as a sudden, paralyzing chill rushed over his skin. The storm outside roared against the glass, casting long, jagged shadows across the room, and for the first time, Julian realized he wasn't standing with an investor. He was trapped in the dark with a ghost. The confrontation. Julian backed away slowly, his hand instinctively reaching into his inner coat pocket. He pulled out a sleek black revolver, pointing its trembling barrel straight at Maya's chest. The suave, arrogant CFO was gone. In his place stood a broken, terrified man driven to the edge of sanity. Julian, screaming over the thunder. Who are you? What do you know about that night? Ethan. It was Ethan's idea. I didn't want to do it. Maya didn't flinch. She took a step toward the loaded weapon, completely unfazed by the threat to her second life. She slowly reached up to her left hand, unbuttoning her silk glove, and revealed a stunning antique diamond ring resting on her finger, the signature Thorne family heir ring that Zoya had worn on her wedding day. Julian's eyes bulged in absolute horror. The gun shook violently in his grip. Julian, hyperventilating, tears mixing with sweat. No, that's impossible. I watched you fall. You died in the ocean. Maya, voice dropping to a cold, razor-sharp hiss. You tightened the cord, Julian. You leaned into my ear and whispered that my father's fortune was yours. And then you pushed me into the sea. But you forgot one simple truth. A soul ripped away by cold murder never stays at the bottom of the ocean. Julian collapsed to his knees, clutching his head with one hand while keeping the gun raised with the other, babbling in sheer, mad terror. He screamed that he was hallucinating, that a dead bride couldn't be standing before him in another woman's body. Before he could pull the trigger, the glass doors behind him shattered. Ethan burst into the room, drenched in rain, holding a firearm of his own. Driven out of his mind by Maya's anonymous blackmail notes, Ethan believed Julian had lured him there to execute him. Ethan, shouting hysterically, "You betrayed me, Julian! You kept the offshore accounts for yourself." Chaos erupted in the heavy darkness of the conservatory. Driven by pure survival instinct and paranoia, Julian scrambled to his feet and lunged at Ethan. A frantic, desperate struggle broke out between the two co-conspirators over the fallen gun. Flesh hit marble. Curses were shouted into the storm, and then, bang! A single, deafening gunshot echoed through the conservatory, cutting through the thunder. Ethan stumbled backward, his hands clutching his bleeding chest in shock. He fell heavily onto the marble floor, his eyes rolling back as life drained from his body. Julian stood frozen, gasping for breath, the smoking gun resting in his blood-stained hands. He stared down at his dead accomplice, then looked up at Maya, who hadn't moved an inch. Out on the driveway, bright red and blue lights illuminated the rain. Sirens wailed across the estate grounds as armed police tactical units smashed through the front doors, their megaphones echoing through the halls. Maya had tipped off Scotland Yard hours before setting foot on the property. As heavily armed officers flooded the conservatory, pinning the screaming, hysterical Julian to the floor, Maya stood calmly in the center of the room, looking down at her killer with total, silent victory. The confrontation. Julian backed away, slowly, his hand instinctively reaching into his inner coat pocket. He pulled out a sleek black revolver, pointing its trembling barrel straight at Maya's chest. The suave, arrogant CFO was gone. In his place stood a broken, terrified man driven to the edge of sanity. Julian, screaming over the thunder. Who are you? What do you know about that night? Ethan. It was Ethan's idea. I didn't want to do it. Maya didn't flinch. She took a step toward the loaded weapon, completely unfazed by the threat to her second life. She slowly reached up to her left hand, unbuttoning her silk glove, and revealed a stunning antique diamond ring resting on her finger, the signature Thorne family heir ring that Zoya had worn on her wedding day. Julian's eyes bulged in absolute horror. The gun shook violently in his grip. Julian, hyperventilating, tears mixing with sweat. No, that's impossible. I watched you fall. You died in the ocean. Maya, voice dropping to a cold, razor-sharp hiss. You tightened the cord, Julian. You leaned into my ear and whispered that my father's fortune was yours, and then you pushed me into the sea. But you forgot one simple truth. A soul ripped away by cold murder never stays at the bottom of the ocean. Julian collapsed to his knees, clutching his head with one hand while keeping the gun raised with the other, babbling in sheer, mad terror. He screamed that he was hallucinating, that a dead bride couldn't be standing before him in another woman's body. Before he could pull the trigger, the glass doors behind him shattered. Ethan burst into the room, drenched in rain, holding a firearm of his own. Driven out of his mind by Maya's anonymous blackmail notes, Ethan believed Julian had lured him there to execute him. Ethan, shouting hysterically, "You betrayed me, Julian! You kept the offshore accounts for yourself." Chaos erupted in the heavy darkness of the conservatory. Driven by pure survival instinct and paranoia, Julian scrambled to his feet and lunged at Ethan. A frantic, desperate struggle broke out between the two co-conspirators over the fallen gun. Flesh hit marble, curses were shouted into the storm, and then, bang! A single, deafening gunshot echoed through the conservatory, cutting through the thunder. Ethan stumbled backward, his hands clutching his bleeding chest in shock. He fell heavily onto the marble floor, his eyes rolling back as life drained from his body. Julian stood frozen, gasping for breath, the smoking gun resting in his blood-stained hands. He stared down at his dead accomplice, then looked up at Maya, who hadn't moved an inch. Out on the driveway, bright red and blue lights illuminated the rain. Sirens wailed across the estate grounds as armed police tactical units smashed through the front doors, their megaphones echoing through the halls. Maya had tipped off Scotland Yard hours before setting foot on the property. As heavily armed officers flooded the conservatory, pinning the screaming, hysterical Julian to the floor, Maya stood calmly in the center of the room, looking down at her killer with total, silent victory. The final reckoning. The glaring red and blue strobe lights of the tactical vehicles danced across the high, arched ceiling of the conservatory. Armed officers moved with practiced speed, securing the perimeter and disarming a weeping, unraveling Julian. As heavy steel handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Julian's hysterical screams echoed through the grand halls, babbling about ghosts, a drowned bride, and a woman who had returned from the deep to claim her blood debt. Federal agents led him out into the pouring rain, past the flashbulbs of reporters who had rushed to the estate gates. The grand illusion was shattered. Julian Thorne's name was plastered across every global network, not as a visionary CEO, but as a ruthless murderer and fraudster caught red-handed. Maya stood untouched amidst the broken glass and police tape. Detective Chief Inspector Ross approached her, stepping carefully around the forensic markers. He looked at the serene, unbothered young woman who had provided Scotland Yard with an airtight paper trail of corporate embezzlement, fraudulent transactions, and conspiracy to commit murder. "Inspector Ross, Ms. Lynn, your anonymous tips and financial ledgers held up. The case against Julian and Ethan's syndicate is closed. But I have to ask, how did an outside investor uncover details about Zoya Thorne's death that even our top investigators missed?" Maya turned slowly, looking at the inspector with dark, unreadable eyes. A faint, knowing smile touched her lips. "Maya, sometimes, Inspector, the victims leave behind whispers that only those who listen carefully can hear. Justice wasn't brought by an outsider. It was simply a debt collected in full." Without another word, Maya walked past the police cordon, stepping out into the cool night air. Epilogue. 3 weeks later, the morning sun finally broke through London's persistent haze, painting the sky in vibrant shades of gold and amber. Thorne Enterprises had been legally dissolved and reorganized. Under Maya Lynn's direct management, the stolen assets were returned to legitimate charitable trusts and foundation funds set up in her father's honor. The corporate vultures had been purged, and the legacy of the Thorne family was restored to clean hands. Maya stood at the very edge of the stone balcony on the cliffside of the Thorne estate. Below her, the roaring ocean waves that had once swallowed Zoya's breath were calm, shimmering under the warm sunlight. The breeze pulled gently at her dark hair. She reached down to her finger, slowly sliding off the antique Thorne family diamond ring, the last physical anchor to the life that had been taken from her. She held it up to the morning light, watching the diamond sparkle one final time. With a peaceful, cleansing breath, Maya let the ring slip from her fingers. She watched it fall, spiraling down through the air until it splashed quietly into the vast, blue depths below. The ocean had taken Zoya, but it had returned something far stronger. The past was buried. The killers were paying their toll in darkness, and Maya walked away from the ledge, ready to step into the world and live her second life entirely on her own terms. The end.